Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is leading aircraftman Mark Ritchie. Tomorrow marks the first sitting day for the newly elected 47th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial and reflect on the political, economic and religious freedoms afforded to us as Australians. These freedoms are underpinned by those who serve and have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells remind us of what it means to be an Australian. We are committed to one another, our nation, and the ideals of mankind. Here with us today are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour cloaking us reminds us of the costs of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of Parliament commence the sitting period, your presence here speaks to every Australian, whether by birth or by choice, of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and our country. We thank you for your commitment to service, which reflects the essence of the Australian spirit, a spirit that we also showcase here in the stories told at the Australian War Memorial. Shortly, we will hear the story of Private Joseph John Dale, who lost his life while serving Australia in the First World War, and warmly welcome his family members who are here with us this evening. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 47th Parliament of Australia who are joining us here this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge Vice Admiral David Johnston, representing the Chief of Defence Force, other members of the Australian Defence Force, Mr Kerry Stokes, former Chair of the Council and Fellow of the Australian War Memorial, the Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I would now like to invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge Opposition Leader Peter Dutton and all my parliamentary colleagues. To Brendan Nelson, the Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. To Matt Anderson, PSM, Director of the Australian War Memorial. To Vice Admiral David Johnson, representing the Chief of the Defence Force. Rear Admiral Christopher Smith, representing Chief of Navy. Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of Army. Air Marshal Robert Chipman, Chief of Air Force. I acknowledge all veterans and serving members of the ADF represented here this evening, and a special acknowledgement for former Prime Minister John Howard, who has joined us here this evening as well. The first bullet of World War I heralded a calamity on a scale unknown to humanity. The last shot was followed by silence. As Charles Bean wrote of the eerie quiet that settled along the Western Front, the change went too deep for actual rejoicing. The sounds of guns ceased, the gates of the future silently opened. While many of our soldiers found ways to celebrate, many greeted the peace with their own quiet. Unlike the children who chalked the walls of village houses with messages celebrating the end of the war, many couldn't even bring themselves to note it in their diaries. In the spare words of one Australian digger, it was over. That was enough. We thank them for the peace that came when the final shell crater had uncurled its final wisp of smoke, when the sea and the sky were killing grounds no more, when the last coil of barbed wire had been cut apart or turned to rust, when the singing of bullets had given way to the song of birds, when the naked mud had begun to once again be clothed in grass and flowers, hellscapes turned back to meadow and farmland, when ruin had given way to rebuilding. But as those who survived the war to end all wars soon learned, victory in war offers no guarantee of the victory of peace. Another war came. Another generation of Australians went, and at the end of it, another silence. It was the silence of guns suddenly stilled, of planes left on the ground, of ships with their cannons lowered. But it was also the silence of the dead and the grief of those that they tragically left behind. Each time we honour our fallen with silence, it is a silence that also contains within it the hope that humanity has at last learnt its lesson. The hope that this will never, ever happen again. Hope, it must be said, is playing a long game, and hope may yet, and we all wish that it does, win out. But we will keep returning to this silence, this solemn quiet that holds both endings and beginnings, of exhaustion and rebirth, and a belief in humanity that somehow survives and holds on despite everything that is thrown at it. It is a silence that I hope our courageous, suffering friends in Ukraine will also soon know. For so many of our veterans, silence is also a shield against the world, an outer stillness while within them the cacophony of war rages on. That has been the experience for so many, whether they raised arms against the enemy or worked desperately to save the lives of the wounded and the dying. But when that outer silence ends, when that shield is lowered, we must listen. Listen even to the silence. Just as our veterans stepped up for us, we must step up for them. We owe them a debt greater than mere gratitude. I have stood here before and cited the examples of my great mentor, Tom Uren, a giant of the Labor Party, and Sir John Carrick, a giant of the Liberal Party. Two great comrades with each other. Two great Australians who, even amid the deprivation of prisoner of war camps, managed to encapsulate what is best about our national character, that our deepest instinct is to respond to the worst of times by being our absolute best. As we gather in this place of memory, we honour all those who have gone in our name. We honour them as the bugler sounds the last post. We honour them as the piper plays the flowers of the forest, a lament of stately sadness unsoftened by the passing of centuries. But in our gratitude and sorrow at their sacrifice, we honour them most profoundly with silence, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd now like to invite the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
Prime Minister, my parliamentary colleagues, Mr Matt Anderson, the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr Brendan Nelson, the Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Vice Admiral David Johnston, representing the Chief of the Defence Force, Rear Admiral Christopher Smith, representing the Chief of Navy, Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of Army, the Honourable John Howard, our former Prime Minister, Air Marshal Robert Chipman, the Chief of the Air Force, fellow members who have served our country, and can I particularly acknowledge this afternoon those who are here in uniform. All who walk into this National War Memorial are struck by the weight of history, by the sacrifices of so many, by the losses endured by so many more. As we wander the cloisters of the commemorative courtyard, we are taken aback by the seemingly endless rows of names recorded on the bronze panels of the Roll of Honour. No other place in our nation so profoundly embodies the collective deeds of Australians whom generation upon generation put country, community and their loved ones before themselves. Particularly when we comprehend that behind each name is a person, and behind each person a story, and behind each story a family. By learning about the person, the story and the family behind a name, we bridge the gap between the foreign past and the familiar present. For we quickly recognise that those remarkable individuals who we commemorate today were, like us, ordinary Australians. What made them remarkable was that they did the extraordinary, despite being ordinary, answering the times and circumstances in which they found themselves. Albert Thistlethwaite was one such remarkable Australian. He was one of 6 children from a farming family in Samsonvale in Queensland. Albert was initially rejected for service due to his slight deafness, but he soon found himself on the Western Front. At age 21, Private Thistlethwaite of the 42nd Australian Infantry Battalion was killed near Ypres on the 13th of October 1917. His 3 brothers, who also enlisted, would fortuitously return home from the horrors of the First World War, unlike so many of their fellow countrymen. Robert Neville Lonergan was another remarkable Australian. He grew up in the interwar years in Brisbane and worked as a clerk. In 1941, Robert and his fellow airmen from Australia and Canada proudly posed for a photograph, having recently received their wings. And on the 10th of March 1942, the 22-year-old RAF Flight Sergeant Lonergan was flying with a Canadian crew. They were among squadrons of Allied bombers charged with destroying armament factories in the German industrial town of Essen. His plane, like so many in the Second World War, never made it home. 2 world wars, 2 ordinary Australians who did the extraordinary. Private Thistlethwaite and Flight Sergeant Lonergan. They are commemorated respectively at memorials in Samford and Clangar in my electorate of Dixon. And I pay my respects to them here this afternoon in our most sacred war memorial. Equally, I pay my respects also to Private Joseph John Dale of the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion, whose service and sacrifice we commemorate, especially during this last post ceremony alongside his family. At the going down of the sun, we honour all Australians who have served, all those who gave their lives, all those who returned home bearing wounds, seen and unseen. And in the morning, as we commence the work of the 47th Parliament of Australia, let us remember this. Our fortunate country today is neither the result of luck nor natural occurrence. It has been forged, fought for and defended by those before us. In this, we are the beneficiaries of a great inheritance, one which most people in history could never have imagined, or at best dreamt about. We are the custodians of a legacy which past generations helped create and safeguard through their sacrifice. And we owe it to those who came before us, those we represent today, and those who will come after us, never to drift into complacency. As we confront conflict in Eastern Europe and coercion in the Indo-Pacific, we must come together as a nation. We must have confidence in our convictions and ourselves, and we must press forward with energised commitment and action to protect sovereignty and self-determination, law and liberty, peace and prosperity. The Australian War Memorial is a reminder that it can be done, that the ordinary can be the extraordinary, lest we forget.
If you're able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult Party, attention! Catapult Party, present arms!
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. With golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult Party, shoulder, arms. Catapult Party, order, arms.
Students, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's first World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record, which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths of floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The family of Private Joseph John Dale. The Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Senator the Honourable Slade Brockman, President of the Senate, and the Honourable Andrew Wallace, Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honourable Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Andrew Hastie, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Matt Keogh, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and Senator James Patterson, representing the Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. The Honourable Pat Conroy, Minister for Defence Industry, and the Honourable Luke Howarth, Shadow Minister for Defence Industry and Shadow Minister for Defence Personnel. The Honourable Matt Thistlethwaite, Assistant Minister for Defence and Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs, and Mr Philip Thompson, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. Vice Admiral David Johnson, representing the Chief of the Defence Force. The Honourable Dr. Brendan Nelson, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Mr. Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr. Kerry Stokes, former Chair of the Council and Fellow of the Australian War Memorial. And the final wreath this evening will now be laid by students on behalf of the Brighton Grammar School from Brighton in Victoria.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Joseph John Dale. Joseph Dale was born in 1889 in the Melbourne suburb of Brunswick, the third child born to Joseph William and Anne Dale. His family moved to Coleraine in Western Victoria when he was a child. He attended Coleraine State School and after leaving school, trained as a carpenter before going into partnership with his father's construction company. In April 1916, Joseph decided to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force. He joined up at the nearby town of Hamilton and was allotted to the 39th Battalion, part of the newly formed 3rd Division. On the 27th of May, he embarked with his unit aboard the transport ship Arsenius, bound for the Western Front. After a 7-week voyage, including 3 days in the ship's sick bay with a bout of influenza, Joseph arrived in England with his comrades in mid-July. There, the men underwent further training at the army camps on Salisbury Plain for a further 4 months. By November 1916, they were ready. The division, including Joseph Dale and the 39th Battalion, was shipped across the Channel to France. Initially deployed to the quiet Armentières sector in Flanders, known as the Nursery Sector, the 3rd Division learned the ways of trench warfare on the Western Front during the winter. In April 1917, the men were moved north across the Franco-Belgian border to prepare for a big attack. On the 7th of June, Joseph Dale and his comrades participated in the Battle of Messines, capturing all their objectives but suffering heavy casualties. Moving northwards once again to the Ypres-Passchendaele front, in October, the 3rd Division fought at the Battle of Broodsinder, then took part in the costly and futile attempt to capture Passchendaele. With the offensive drawing to a close and winter setting in, Joseph and his comrades spent the next few months resting and training in northern France and Belgium, rotating between the rear areas and the relatively quiet sectors of the front. Their respite would not last long. On the 21st of March 1918, the Germans launched what would be their final major assault of the war. With Russia now out of the war, Germany seized the opportunity to transfer 1 million men to the Western Front to try and force a decision in France before the bulk of the United States Army could arrive. One of their key objectives was to capture the rail hub of Amiens, splitting British forces in the north from their French allies in the south. The Australians were rushed to the Somme in order to help stop the German attack. Dale and the 39th Battalion were positioned on the Ancre River, just north of the Somme. They fought stubbornly alongside units of the 4th Division at 2 battles near Derincourt at the end of March and in early April. As losses mounted, Dale was appointed temporary corporal, then took on acting sergeant's duties. With the crisis over, he reverted to the rank of private. The 39th Battalion remained in the area east of Amiens over the next few months as spring gave way to summer. His family in Australia received letters. Joseph reported he was doing well, but his health later took a turn for the worse. Having been granted leave in England, the day he arrived, he was admitted to the Australian hospital at Harefield Park, suffering from influenza. 4 days later, on the 27th of June 1918, he died of pneumonia and heart failure. It seems Joseph Dale was a victim of the first wave of the Spanish flu, an influenza pandemic that would go on to claim some 50 million lives over the next 2 years. He was 29 years old. Joseph was buried at Harefield St Mary's Churchyard near the hospital, alongside more than 100 other Commonwealth soldiers who died of illness there during the war. In October 1918, a woman calling herself Mary Dale wrote to the military authorities, informing them she was Joseph's fiancée and de facto partner, and that she had since given birth to his daughter, Josephine. Unable to work, she inquired whether she might be entitled to a pension to support herself and the baby. Although Joseph's father denied having heard of this relationship, the army accepted the claim with some reservations. The war gratuity and Joseph's Victory Medal were held in trust for his daughter, while his British War Medal was sent to his father. DNA testing is said to have later confirmed that Josephine was indeed Joseph and Mary's daughter. Private Joseph John Dale is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today besides the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Joseph John Dale, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Party presents arms.
lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director and staff, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.